Thanks for the chance to come talk about this research. Just to give you a little bit of background on what we wanted to do and why we do it. My research partner and I are very interested in the implications of what happens in an era of abundance. Social media has afforded journalists and citizens alike the ability to be involved in the news conversation in big ways. And so what ends up happening over the course of a day, during breaking news events or just regular news events, is people who are following along on social media are often inundated with information from sources they don't often know where it's coming from. The act of the retweet gives me the ability to share news with other people who are not following the people that I follow. And so what ends up happening is we end up with a bit of a credibility crisis in moments of big news. People run into information, they don't necessarily can't use the same heuristics in terms of deciding who to trust. It's not the days of, oh, well, somebody has the ability to publish it, they must know what they're doing. And so that game has changed quite a bit. So we have been working on this idea of what we call snap judgments. The idea that when somebody runs in information on Twitter or some sort of social product, the first thing they're trying to do is figure out, does this person know what the hell they're talking about? And we do these things in more complex ways than we would do if it just had the New York Times brand on top of it. And we are making pretty subtle judgments in some cases about where information is coming from. And that's really kind of the basis of what this research that we've been doing is some of the questions we're trying to answer is how do people judge credibility when they run into information from people they don't know online? Okay. So we studied two basic variables, and I want to unpack that first. And the first one is interactivity. Okay, I have to point this at that apparently. First one is interactivity, which is a pretty often studied topic. It's not the core of this research by any stretch, but it's that replying, that talking to people, engaging with them, showing what we call an intention to interact by retweeting. It's a sign that I'm listening, not just posting content online. The second variable we were looking at is this thing called social cue. Social cue is the disclosure of personal details about yourself online. So you can see on the board some of the examples of differences between high and low social cue. High social cue is not just saying my work, my affiliation, but it's also some personal facts about myself, the things that I'm involved in. Whereas low social cue, I'm giving a shout out to Marty Barrett, the most famous Lehigh University alum, is basically just your work affiliation, who you work for, what you do. Okay. So these are the two variables we were looking at when we were deciding what we were going to do for this study. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of background on why we did this. First of all, this is based on, this is a follow-up study to something that just published in Journals of Mass Communication Quarterly. I'm not going to go into great detail about this article that is published, but if you'd like a copy, you could certainly tweet at me and I'd be happy to send it to you. What we did in that study was a field experiment that looked at these factors of interactivity and social cue in relationship to how people judge credibility. Here's what we found. We found that people who were highly interactive, journalists who were highly interactive, were judged to be more credible by people who were making these snap judgments about information they're running into. Social cue didn't play much of a role in that study. Interestingly, just as a side note, this actually mitigated some gender effects we often see in credibility studies. It's often been found that women tend to be judged much more harshly than men when it comes to journalistic credibility, and we actually found that if people were interactive, there were some mitigating factors that actually made those two gender differences fairly equal. So this is the background of the study. This is a lab experiment. We thought, that's kind of interesting. People who are interactive get judged more credible. So then our next question that we started to ask ourselves was, okay, well, wait a second. What are journalists actually doing with this? So our purpose was to investigate that next question. And we did that by taking a look at those relationships between interactivity, social presence, and what journalists are actually doing online. So what we did here for this research was a content analysis study. It was taking a look at journalistic profiles and journalistic feeds. We examined 555 journalistic profiles and analyzed them for this research. Just taking a peek at what that looked like, so you can see we looked at a few different things in addition to interactivity. Interactivity was judged by taking a look at the last 20 tweets, and we were judging how many of them were just straight off tweets of just their own nature or tweets with the link versus ones that actually had active replying, retweeting, and things like that going on. We also took a look at their biographies. We judged social Q basically by adding up the number of facts that were being shared and did that as a ratio of how many of them were social disclosure. Okay. And we then also coded, I'll talk about this in a second, along the lines of coverage area, the kind of topics these people worked in. These profiles were pulled from Muck Rack. They were global in nature, so they were not just United States-based journalists. They were a global sample. Interestingly enough, we didn't find much difference between global and U.S.-based journalists, but the sample was fairly robust in that regard in terms of geographic spread. So here's some things we found. First of all, about 43% of profiles exhibited high social Q, which actually surprised me a little bit, just because when I talk with journalists, they often say they hesitate a little bit to put themselves out there. There's a lot of it is about describing themselves in terms of their work. I'm a reporter, I'm an editor, I work for such and such outlet. And journalists, in my estimation, just from anecdotal talking with them, I was surprised to see this number this high. People are often sharing some type of personal detail. And I will tell you how we determined high social Q. What we did is we took the pool of people we analyzed, and we came up with basically a mean score for what the average level of social disclosure was in terms of a percentage. And we rated people high if they were over the mean and low if they were under the mean. So the mean score was something about 30% or so of the facts were demonstrated social Q, or basically social presence. And so 43% of people were experiencing more than a third of their facts were some sort of social disclosure, which is a bit of a surprise. The other thing we found was that there was a bit of a split here. There were certain topics that we tended to see more social disclosure than others. So some of the softer topics like lifestyle, maybe if you count opinion in that category. Science and technology and business tended to generate a little bit more social disclosure. They're definitely above the mean, whereas at the other end of the scale, people who are covering civic issues, that included things like politics, media, entertainment, sports, they tended to have less. Okay, so that first variable, social Q, we saw about 43% that were high. Moving on to interactivity, it was about the same kind of thing. About 40% it demonstrated some interactivity. This was pretty much in line with past research that's been done on interactivity. I told you this has been much more studied in our field. We didn't see much difference between this and what's been found in past research. I will tell you one of the things that we did was different in this study was we broke it out along topic, and that is something that is much less studied here. And if you break it out along topic, you actually see interactivity is pretty high for some of these categories. Lifestyle news, journalists tend to interact more with their audience. We can't talk about this anymore as if journalists are not interactive online. I don't think we can say that in a monolithic way after taking a look at some of these results. Certain topics tended to lend themselves more toward interaction than others. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, if you go back and forth, is that interactivity and social Q basically kind of look the same along topics. I mean, they're kind of grouping at one or other end of the scale. The only exception to that really has been the media entertainment category. Otherwise, they're kind of roughly separating themselves on basically the same ends of the spectrum, which we'll come back to in a second. So the other part of this was that once we ran some regressions to take a look at what some of this stuff meant, and what we found was this is another thing that was kind of a new finding, is that while social presence in the original study that we did not predict credibility, but interactivity did, what we found in this research was that social presence actually does predict interactivity, which is kind of interesting. That it's not we can't say that they are both causing some sense of higher credibility among the people who are making these snap judgments about Twitter profiles and information they run into online, but we can say that people who are more likely to disclose information about themselves are also more likely to interact online. The other thing I did mention was the job, not topic area does drive it. So I mentioned the difference in the beat topic that some of these journalists were looking at. But the other thing I want to point out was that we did find that editors and executives are much less likely to interact online, and people who identify themselves as reporters, because we did code along job type, tended to be much more interactive. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, we talk in newsroom training sometime, and this is more of a professional implication. We talk in newsroom training all the time. How do we get these journalists to talk more to their audience? How do we get them to listen more and engage with them more? And this research suggests that it's possible that social presence may be a good bridge into helping people interact. That if we want to help our reporters and journalists in our newsrooms engage with their audiences, one of the first things we need to do is teach them how to open up. Disclose things about themselves. Now, of course, that's always a fine line. And I know this is a debate. I don't want to sell that short. The things we disclose and how much we disclose, I think, is a topic that people worry about to some degree. Putting yourself out there too much, making much too less about the job that you're doing. But it's possible here that social disclosure is a possible bridge. As part of our training, do we help people understand that by taking a step out there, putting yourself out there a little bit much might be also a bridge toward the next step, which is listening, engaging, making sure that people know you're listening to them. Secondly, I think it has implications for how do we train. So if we know that people are making disclosures, maybe we accept the idea that this isn't a bad idea. How do we draw those lines? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. I'm not going to claim to, but there might be a set of best practices that we can start talking about in future research that would take a look at. How do journalists make these decisions about what to share about themselves? And what are the topics that are off limits to them? What are the things that are more likely for them to share? We didn't really take a look at that in this research, but I think it would be kind of an interesting area because it might help us come up with a set of what are the best practices for how journalists disclose things about themselves. Third implication about this is that I think it's time to stop talking about interactivity as this thing that journalists don't do. This research shows that that's actually not true. It's actually more like people are tending to self-select out of it in certain beat areas. And I was kind of surprised by some of these results, to be honest. I was expecting sports writers, in particular sports journalists, to be a little more interactive. My impression, and this is my own bias because I worked in sports when I was in journalism, is that sports writers tend to be a little more pushing forward in terms of technology and things like that. And we found that we're very close compared to their peers. And we didn't really know what that was, but I think this is something that we should investigate in future work. One of our hypotheses is that sports journalists and political journalists tended to group at the lower end of the scale in interactivity and social cue. And so what might be happening there is they may be dealing with passionate audiences that might turn against them. They may be worried about trolls. They may be worried about people who are going to strike back at them, and so they don't want to take a step out there too much if they're dealing with audiences that might have a little more passionate response than if you say something really bad about, like oregano, if you're a cooking journalist, for example. We don't exactly know what that looks like, but it was very interesting that there were a couple that tended to group on the lower end that definitely dealt in areas where people tend to have fandom attached to it, politics and sports and things like that. And that's it. So thank you.